listener production.
Hello, Antoinette Lattouf with you. Welcome to the briefing. So with winter finally turning to spring over the weekend, we're heading towards peak moving season. Now, moving house can be one of life's most stressful events, made even more stressful by the process of trying to get your bond back.
I think that there's definitely a problem within the bond system that it is too easy to make a claim that doesn't stack up with any evidence.
Today we're bringing you two special episodes on the messy world of rental bonds. So the first deep dive examines how to stop your landlord stealing your bond, and also whether there's a way to run this system that's better for everyone. But first, let's get into the headlines with Bension Siebert. It's Monday, September 2nd.
Hey everyone, it's day 4 of the Paralympics in Paris, and Aussie duo Nikki Ayers and Jed Olschwager have won Australia's first Paralympic rowing gold in the PR3 mixed double sculls. We've also had success in the pool, where para-swimmer Rowan Crothers has taken silver in the men's 100-metre freestyle S10, as has Ahmed Kelly in the men's 150-metre individual medley SM3.
Yeah, Benson, I don't know if you recall, but it was a bit of touch and go as to whether Kelly would even compete in the medley because he was disqualified following his heat. The officials claimed that he performed butterfly during the freestyle leg. However, there was a protest launched by Swimming Australia and that was upheld, and Kelly was reinstated in time for the final. So I don't know also if you know much about Ahmed Kelly. He's an Iraqi-born Australian. He's an amputee, so he's missing both arms below the elbow and both legs entirely. And that's because he was exposed to chemical weapons in utero and he was born with severely underdeveloped limbs. In other news, our mixed relay team also claimed silver in the 4x100 freestyle relay.
And the medal tally, Australia is on 21 now. We've got 6 gold, 6 silver, 9 bronze. That leaves us in 6th place. Yesterday, we picked up another medal with Eric Horry elevated to bronze in the men's final PR1 single sculls after Italy's Giacomo Perini was disqualified for using a communication device that's either a mobile phone or a walkie-talkie during the race.
Israel's biggest labour union is set to stage a national strike after the bodies of 6 hostages held by Hamas were recovered by Israeli forces in Gaza. The chairman of the Histadrut is calling on workers to walk off the job from 6 a.m. local time today, adding that Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport will be closed from 8. Saying we are getting body bags instead of a deal. So among the hostages whose bodies have been recovered was a 23-year-old American citizen, Hirsch Goldberg Poland. And you might remember his parents spoke just last month at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Hirsch's left forearm, his dominant arm, was blown off before he was loaded onto a pickup truck and stolen from his life and me and John into Gaza.
Meantime, the first phase of a polio vaccination campaign has begun in the middle areas of Gaza. The UN is aiming to inoculate 600,000 children in the coming days. It is a huge task. They need to vaccinate 90% of the population in order to stop the spread. The head of the UN's refugee agency in Palestine, UNRWA, has described the campaign as a race against time. Last week, the territory recorded its first case of type 2 polio since 1999, when a 10-month-old boy who had been crawling early was now paralysed in one leg. It's a really tragic development in the history of this war, and he is hoping that that vaccination campaign can be successful.
Millions of Australians are being told it might be a good idea to work from home today, and that's thanks to wild weather. In Tasmania, evacuation notices have been issued in areas northwest of Hobart. That's because of heavy rain, damaging winds and power outages that are continuing across the state. Over the weekend, around 30,000 people were without power, and the State Emergencies Management Minister says the damage bill is likely to be significant. And in Victoria, residents are being told to avoid overnight travel and prepare for power outages. The Weather Bureau is predicting damaging winds of up to 130 k's an hour in some parts of the state. And that's thanks to a vigorous west to northwesterly airstream.
Yes, and a number of state and private schools are closed today, with some principals sending out emails to parents last night. The state has been battered by severe weather over the last week, with the SES receiving more than 3,000 requests for assistance, and at its peak, more than 35,000 homes were without power.
And the New South Wales East Coast, including some of Sydney, won't be spared from these wild conditions. So there are damaging winds expected, averaging 60 to 70 k's, and that'll peak up to 100 k's an hour. And that's likely this morning till early afternoon.
And 10,000 Aussie teens have been asked what they want to be when they grow up. Students were asked what they wanted to be at the age of 30. Results show teaching is no longer the post-school career of choice for Australian teenage girls, who are now much more interested in pursuing a highly paid career in medicine or working in other healthcare professions than returning to the classroom. Other top career goals for girls include actor and lawyer. Things haven't shifted much for teen boys, with professional athlete remaining the coveted top job.
Yeah, so Bension, the last time this question was asked was 4 years ago. So it's interesting to monitor the shift, given that the last time the question was asked was before COVID. Also for boys, mechanic, engineer and physio were among the most appealing career choices. And now, Bension, the reason this question was asked by the National Centre for Vocational Education Research was because there is evidence to suggest that if teenagers have clear career goals, they're more likely to perform better at school. It also found that by the time students had reached the age of 25, only half actually achieved their goals. And it's interesting, and I'm, impressed to see that girls are aiming for more prestigious goals. And I also think it's pretty cute that boys all still think they can be sports stars at 15, because generally by 15 you kind of know whether you're very good at something or not, right?
Yeah, I actually had a second puberty when I was 21 or 22, so I was no good at anything athletic or sporting until well into my adulthood. So I definitely would not have been thinking that I could be a sports star when I grew up.
Well, I knew by that age that I wanted to be a journalist. So there's that. While it's good news that young women are looking towards more prestigious and well-paying jobs, obviously this is bad news for the education sector, which is struggling to attract teachers, and we're desperately in need of more teachers. So that's it from me, but stick around. There's more from Bension as he takes a deep dive into the world of rental bonds.
Renting in Australia sucks so much. Black mould, landlords refusing to do necessary repairs, unreasonable rent hikes. You can feel completely powerless in the place that you call home, and you could be stretching your budget just for the privilege. Many of us are priced out of buying a home, and so we just have to cop it. And when you get to the end of a tenancy, with your belongings in boxes and a looming deadline to leave, you can be hit with a bond dispute. If you don't agree with your landlord about the state of the property when you got it, or the state of the property when you left, you could be tied up waiting for months or even years to have your day in a tribunal to sort it out. So how can you protect your bond now? And is there any better way to do this? Leo Patterson-Ross is the CEO of the New South Wales Tenants Union. Leo, thanks so much for joining us. What do you hear from tenants about what's happening to their bonds in the current system?
So people are really worried about getting their bond back at the end of the tenancy. Partly that's just because it's their money and they want it back. But often it's also because they are trying to find a new home and they need the bond money for that. So there's a lot of moving costs. The average move we calculated costs around $4,500 before you get to the bond. And that obviously just adds even more on top. And then, look, actually people also get worried about the bond because it represents something about their tenancy. So, a claim on cleaning costs or a claim on damage can feel like a little bit of a slight on how you have lived your life in the home. And often if you're being told to get your place to a really pristine condition rather than a lived-in but clean condition, then that can feel like a bit of a judgment.
Is it the case that some landlords or some real estate agents on behalf of landlords are getting away with kind of stealing or hoarding bonds from tenants that they shouldn't?
Look, I think that there's definitely a problem within the bond system that it is too easy to make a claim that doesn't stack up with any evidence, and that can create a bit of a culture of sort of having a go at claiming the bond even if you don't really have all the T's crossed and I's dotted that would actually support that claim. And so I think that's quite widespread. And then there's, I think, at least a portion of people who really almost build it into their business model of trying to claim as many bonds as they can. But it's hard to know how much is an intentional, almost kind of malicious sort of act, and how much is actually just we don't have a culture in Australia of respecting tenants and respecting tenants' money or enforcing tenancy law. A lot of it is resting on the renter themselves to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and that's just not an effective way of running a renting system.
Two terms that are kind of important in this whole world are wear and tear and reasonably clean. How does anyone know what fair wear and tear is, or what's reasonably clean under the law?
I think a lot of people struggle, as you say. Fair wear and tear, what it's supposed to mean is that it's the natural usage of a property. So actually wear is the usage by kind of a human, and tear is the sort of wearing away by the world, by the elements. So sometimes I use the example of carpet, right? You both walk on carpet and slowly it's going to get worn away because you're just walking back and forth, and the colours are going to fade because the sun's shining on it. And so the idea is that as the renter, you're not responsible for this sort of normal usage. And so you aren't responsible for the cost of that. And so it shouldn't be part of bond claims. Reasonable's sort of even trickier because reasonable is sort of about what the community expectation of cleanliness is. So that's not showroom clean. It's not pristine condition. There is actually within the law an expectation that the landlord will have some work to do to prepare the property for the next person. But part of this culture around the bonds is actually trying to get the renter to do that preparation work to lift the standard, not from reasonably clean or the normal usage, but actually lift it up to the standard that a new tenant should move in at.
What practical steps can a renter take if they want to make sure that they get their bond back at the end of a tenancy?
So the biggest thing people need to do is have a record, have documentation about the condition of the property at the beginning and at the end. Now, there's actually a formal process around this. That's the condition report. And that's a written version where at move-in, you are given the opportunity to both see what the landlord or the agent says about the condition and agree with it. But because it's written and because it's a tick box system for most people, it can be difficult to know exactly what those words mean. So, for instance, when someone says a mark on the wall, well, was that a 5 centimetre long mark or a 20 centimetre long mark? Was it a pencil mark or a gouge? People use different language to mean different things, and that can still create quite a lot of uncertainty. And so one thing that people can do is take photos, because that becomes much more an objective test about was the condition at the beginning of the property the same as the condition at the end, or what was the change? So documentary records, definitely the biggest thing that can really make a big difference when you're getting to the bond claim.
Is it fair that tenants have to pay bonds in the first place? Because landlords often don't know the person who's moving into the house that they own. They want to make sure that the tenant keeps it safe and looks after it properly. Is it fair enough that they ask for security at the start of the tenancy?
So there is something in having some level of security. There's some kind of risk. And the idea of the bond, to put the pro case, is to say that sometimes when you're moving out, you won't have the funds to cover what might be a reasonable cost. And so you've got a deposit there in the same way that we have all sorts of deposits for all sorts of different things. When you hire a paddleboard or a surfboard or something, like you often leave something as a deposit. The issue is about the amount of it. Is it actually reflective of the kind of the risk you kind of pose and that might reasonably come up? And that's where it starts to feel too much, particularly in the current context where because rents have been increasing so fast, bonds have been increasing really quickly as well. And so now we're seeing, the average bond well over $2,000 in New South Wales. It's rising in most states. We're seeing that the gap between what a reasonable cleaning charge that maybe you did owe and what you've been having to have locked up in the bond board is growing. And so when we look at the stats in New South Wales, we can see that the vast majority of people receive their bond back, at least in part, and most people receive it back in full. So 60% plus every year receive all of their bond back, and about another quarter of people lose something from the bond, but not all of it. And of those claims, it's usually around 2 weeks or less of the bond that's claimed. And then only 14, 15% of people lose the full bond. And so the risk there relative to the cost to the tenant is quite low.
If you talk to basically any renter, they might have a horror story either about a real estate agent or a landlord. But also, if you talk to a landlord, they might say, well, I had a tenant and they were awful and they left rubbish on the property and that kind of thing. Is it fair to acknowledge that there are some bad tenants around there and some of them cause a lot of damage?
Yeah, and that's the reality of life. Sometimes people do have some kind of breakdown, some kind of mishap. Sometimes people have difficulty maintaining a property. And from an investor perspective, that is a risk that's involved in investment. It's not substantially different from running any other business. I used to work in a supermarket and we'd have people, whether it accidentally or intentionally, knock stuff off the shelves and break it, and then there'd be a big mess to clean up and you'd have lost some stock, right? There's a risk involved in that, and you need to have a business plan or an investment plan that appropriately kind of plans for that. And we have set it up so that there seems to be an expectation that there should be almost no risk for investors, but they should get all the reward of the risks that sort of do exist. We should have, some compassion for people whose investment decisions don't pay off if they, genuinely tried. But I think that because they've taken on a huge loan, they don't necessarily have the cash to carry out the repairs, or they might be feeling squeezed. And as loans have gotten more expensive, that's certainly happened. They're therefore putting more and more risk onto renters rather than having invested within their means, invested with a plan to deal with sort of the risks that do come up inevitably in all aspects of our lives.
In Australia, real estate agents are bound to do what's in the best interests of the people who pay them, that is, landlords, but they're also bound to try and be sort of fair mediators to the extent to which they can. Is there a blue sky, fairer version of this system that works elsewhere or could work in the future that would be better than what we're going through at the moment?
In a lot of other countries, landlords still hold the bond themselves, and that was the system in most of Australia until we had the bond boards system that landlords would charge a bond and hold on to it. And actually, that's still the case in the Northern Territory. And that was not a good way of going about things. It was very difficult to get your bond back, and there was much higher rates of just taking it. So we've moved from there, and in a way that's quite unique around the world. So in other countries, there is a little bit more the concept's closer to an insurance product. And so you are out of pocket from the beginning, but you're not as much out of pocket. So for instance, Germany is like that. You'll essentially borrow some money, but it's a deposit for a 10-year lease. And the cost of the bond is a tiny fraction comparatively when you think of it as over 10 years. We have very short leases, and so they're quite high as a comparison. It's, a 12th of your rent for the year. So we would think that it's useful to look at the real risks, to look at what is the bond actually covering, what's the likelihood of it being claimed, and maybe we could think about reducing the size of the bonds. So maybe we don't need 4 weeks anymore. And in some states, it's still 6 weeks for certain tenancies. Maybe we can reduce that.
Leo, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Leo Patterson Ross there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you found this ep useful, why not share a link with a friend? And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with our second episode on the world of bonds, this time asking what part landlords and real estate agents should be playing in all this. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you then.
Listener.